to another edition of The Front Page. My name's Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. It's my privilege to have with me today a very special guest, Interim Police Chief of Manchester, Jim Baker, an old friend of mine. Chief Baker, welcome to GNAT.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Many of you know Chief Baker has been around the law enforcement scene in Vermont for quite some time. He started with the Vermont State Police in 1978. He was the commander of the Shaftesbury Barracks just down the road on 7A there from 1997 to 2000. And then in 2006 was appointed as the head of the Vermont State Police and retired in 2009 as the state's top cop, I guess.
Well, I guess some people would have debated that. So,
well, anyway, that was quite an honor, and he's also one of us. He's a resident of Arlington, and great to have you with us on the show today. So anyway, you retired in 2009, theoretically, but things didn't quite work out as planned, I gather. You were then appointed to be the interim head of the Vermont Police Academy in Pittsford last January, I believe.
Correct.
And you're still up there as well.
I am.
Doing double duty along with being our police chief down here. So you were a member of the search team when former Chief Wessner was retiring or coming up to retirement after 40 years of service to the town, and you were a consultant on that team. But you weren't able to come up with a candidate, I guess, and so you wound up taking the job. I guess. Well, let me just back up for a second. What happened to the retirement plans? I thought you were supposed to be going off into
a lot of folks have said to me, I thought you were going to retire, and the personal plan was never to retire. I mean, I had a great career with the state police. I had a great run. Started in 1978 in Shaftesbury, and I was just fortunate because, as you know, in many careers and professions, it's a matter of being in the right place at the right time. And it seemed like over 31 years I was in the right place at the right time and had different opportunities, and eventually had the opportunity and quite honestly the privilege to run the state police. I retired in June of '09, and the plan was that I was going to take a few months off and work on some projects around the house that had been put on the back burner for 15 or 20 years.
That must have been a pretty long list.
Well, it was a long list that my wife had patiently waited all those years to get done. But just before I got ready to retire, I was contacted by John O'Keefe, the town manager, and we had met and we had had several conversations about me assisting in a search for a new police chief. I think John, as the town manager, and in particular the select board, recognized the gravity of the decision. Fred had served the community so well for 40 years, 32 plus years as the police chief, and it was not going to be an easy task to find a replacement. To fast forward to your question about what happened to the search, I think the part of the answer is in what I just said.
Yeah.
Replacing Fred Wessner was not easy, and he had brought to the town a certain level of professionalism and very steady hand at the wheel that I think was very difficult to replace. And so we went into that process over the summer, and I started helping the town. We designed a search process. And as I like to say, we didn't find a candidate, but we didn't find the wrong candidate. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of situations in Vermont where in particular out-of-state chiefs are hired, and they don't quite understand the culture in Vermont, and they find themselves very quickly, without a good education ahead of time, not understanding the culture of Vermont, not understanding what the law enforcement culture of Vermont is. They find themselves sometimes on the wrong side of the fence, and that didn't happen here.
Well, what is that culture then you're referring to? Is it a case of kind of a small town situation where everybody knows everybody? I mean, would someone from Vermont going to another state have that same problem elsewhere? Is that
I certainly
that localized?
Let me answer first of all. I mean, what is it about Vermont? I mean, Vermont's a pretty special place, and the expectations that are on law enforcement agencies in Vermont, I believe, are much higher than our surrounding New England states, and in my experience across the country. Citizens expect a lot from their police departments, and it can be very demanding. And it can be very demanding on a law enforcement leader. And, I think sometimes people don't appreciate that. The end result of that is you don't often have situations in Vermont that you see on the national news, like we saw 2 weeks ago, where 3 Dallas police officers are beating someone after a traffic stop with nightsticks because the expectations, the standards, the way they're applied here are much different. And so trying to find someone to fit into that state culture, and then I think this situation was more complicated by the fact that Manchester is yet another special piece of real estate within Vermont that has a different expectation of what their police chief should be doing. And I think it was a little difficult to find someone that fits that. I know some people have hit me up and said, was it about, Manchester has, high cost of living and real estate. And I think that played less into it than the select board, the town manager, and the selection committee feeling comfortable with the candidates that came in front of them.
Okay. So is that search process going to be reopened at some point, either later this year or early next year, or where does it stand now?
I think the best way to describe it right now, it's dormant.
Okay.
And, I think as time goes on, I continue to have conversations with the town manager about where I think the police department is at. As we continue to invest in staff inside the police department, I think it's a wait and see what happens. And, I certainly, I'm not interested in the job permanently. When this all didn't work out at the end of June, the town was kind of in the situation where I was their consultant. It would be an awful thing for me to say to the town, hey, thanks a lot for the employment for the last few months. And I know I was supposed to help you find a police chief. I didn't.
See
good
you
luck.
later.
Right.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that to the town.
Right.
And
Right.
so I found myself in this part-time interim role.
Yeah, because you're splitting your time between here and,
I am.
and Pittsford, I guess,
am.
right?
I
That must
am.
be quite a job. I
Yeah,
would
it's
think.
it's not what that's the piece,
Yeah.
Andrew, that I didn't envision in
So
retirement.
that list of things at home is
That's
still
right.
kind of
I didn't envision this
a
part.
lot of boxes still to be checked
That's
off,
correct.
right?
That's correct.
Well, tell me, how you were in the and still are in the police law enforcement scene here in Vermont now for over 30 years. It must have changed a lot. When you started as a trooper back in 1978, I'm sure the job was considerably different from what it is today. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how it's changed and what's different.
It's kind of like I remember back in 1978, 1980, and I hear older members of the state police talking, and they'd be talking about these ancient times, and here I am now, 30 some years later, 33 years later, and I'm going to be now talking like this ancient times.
Oh, well.
It's changed drastically, and not only has it changed drastically since 1978. It's changed drastically in the last 10 years. It's changed drastically in the last 5 years, and it's changed drastically in the last 3 years. And this is what I mean. Back in 1978, I sat inside, for example, a police car that had a rotating blue light on its roof with a siren and one radio that was an old dial radio that gave you 4 channels. And I couldn't communicate with any other law enforcement agency. I could have a scanner in my car, which I bought myself, so I could hear what was going on with the fire and the rescue squads and the other police departments. You look inside a police car today, and it's camera systems, computer systems, 3 or 4 radio systems, cellular technology, GPS technology tracking cars. The technology's changed drastically, and I know we're going to talk at some point about that impact on crime in the country. And when someone asks me my opinion, probably the number one thing that I think is driving down violent crime in the country is the advancement in technology and the ability to be able to be more efficient at your jobs. Here in Vermont, what has changed, and I touched on this earlier about the culture of Vermont. Just before I left the state police, I started seeing this. I think you see it now more and more. Law enforcement's a very demanding job, and the demands are being driven by the expectations of the public. They expect that for the money they invest in their professional law enforcement agencies, that they get their money's worth out of that. And they're not afraid to speak up when they don't think they're getting their money's worth. And that is, for me, a good thing, because the fact of the matter is it raises the bar for a police agency on how they're going to react in their own community.
Are we investing enough, do you think? I mean, I'm sure as a policeman you could always think, yeah, I need another 10% added to my budget.
Well, you can always say it. One of the things that I learned, probably the hard way sometimes, coming up the ranks of the state police is the issue around crime and public safety in communities is not as simple as give me more money. You know, I thought at one time it was just, you know, hire more police officers and we'll take care of this problem. But what you're really dealing with is human behavior. And I think anyone would agree that trying to figure out human behavior sometimes is pretty complicated.
Yeah.
And so the issues around public safety, crime, and what happens in a community is much more complicated than should you just give us more money and we'll take care of this problem. And then you get into the environment we're in right now. That's not even a logical conversation to have with the folks that control purse strings because of the environment we're in right now financially.
Sure. I don't think there's a good chance that the state police or other police agencies will be getting a lot more money to work with. But I mean, I know that from time to time politicians say that we need to, you know, spend more on law enforcement or bulk it up, or they're underpaid, or they're this or that. And I guess I wondered if that really was a serious concern. But
well, I mean, I think there can be a reasonable conversation about the way police officers are compensated consistently in Vermont, because you know, as that expectation has risen from the public, and you know, the court systems and the system itself has expected more from police. The profession has become more professional, and as a result of that, people who work at that level should be fairly compensated for that. That's my position on that.
Well, we were talking a little bit before we went on the air about this Vermont crime report that was released by the Department of Public Safety, I think last week, and it has some interesting statistics in it. The one that struck me the most was that the total amount of crime in Vermont decreased about 1.5% from 2008 to 2009, which I found kind of surprising. I would have thought, you know, with a recession in progress and an economic downturn, people feeling more stressed out economically, that the tendency would have been for us to see an increase in property crime, and maybe that is indeed the case, buried into these statistics. But were you surprised by those numbers, or is it about what you expected?
You know, I guess first of all, I wasn't surprised, and you know, 2009. I mean, I was really only in the business for about a half of that year. You know, I had retired in June of '09, and I wasn't active in law enforcement for that last 6 months. Not surprised. I think when you look at crime stats, probably over the longevity of the last 10 or 15 years, there are no surprises. There are no spikes. You know, the last major spikes we had in major crime in this country was in the early 90s. And, you know, some folks that are in the criminology world will say to you that a lot of that was driven by the crack cocaine trafficking in the major cities and the emerging gangs. And, you know, Vermont's it's always been interesting to me that Vermont's, it's not that we don't have issues around drug and alcohol and those kind of things, because that's what drives much of our crime, including things like domestic violence. But we've kind of been able to keep ourselves in a bubble in Vermont when it comes to real violent crime. There are splashes of it at times, and you know, none of it. You know, many of those cases that are violent, especially where you end up with a death, should not be minimized. In the big picture, we have kind of blurps on radar screens of that kind of violence, but we haven't seen the kind of violence that other areas have had. And I don't know what the explanation for that is. I do think, as I do my other job on training police officers in the state, I remind people that we do a pretty good job of training quality police officers. I think communities have norms that they expect their citizens to behave a certain way, and those norms influence. And I think we have a very good system of supporting people in the state, and I think that plays into why we have a lower crime rate. This stat, I will say, as I said to you before we came on the air, Andrew, is that I think you have to be very careful when you look at the federal crime rate that was released, because the feds only track a very small category. So that 1 in some percent decrease is a 1 in some percent decrease of a very small category of crimes. Murders, forcible rapes, armed robberies, car theft. The things that drive crime in Vermont are things like vandalism, petty theft, the kind of nuisance crimes that happen in small communities that for the victim of that crime, it's still a big deal, but it doesn't rise to the level of being reported by the feds.
What about drug trafficking? I mean, we hear an awful lot about that, you know, and have for quite a long time. I mean, how does that strike you? Is that on the increase, decrease, stabilizing, and is it changing in some way?
Well, I mean, I'm looking at Channel 3 News this morning. Vermont is above the norm. I'll start this conversation by talking about alcohol. Vermont's above the norm in binge drinking amongst teenagers. That should not be something we're proud of. But I think I can say this with a little bit of authority after being in the business 30-some years. There is a culture in Vermont where, it's a rite of passage to teach your teenage kid, hey, this is how you open up a can of Budweiser. And I think those stats reflect that. And I think we've made major progress since I've been involved in this issue since the early 90s to where we are now, but it's an issue we have to continue to work on. I consider alcohol a drug. It's legal. It's regulated. But the emerging drug problem in this state right now is the pharmaceutical drug problem that's driven by the opiate-based drugs. When you look at a statewide picture, that is a major issue right now, pharmaceutical diversion. And I would say to people, just watch the newspapers, the number of people that are being charged currently with the diversion of drugs from pharmacies or what's known as doctor shopping. That is a major problem in the state right now. And it's also, it isn't in a certain sector of the population. Having a conversation with someone the other day at the Secretary of State's office who regulate the medical profession by licensing them. And in the last couple of years, they've disciplined in the 100-ish nurses in the state for the abuse of pharmaceutical drugs and many times the stealing of the drugs from their workplace. And so it's a major problem. It drives a lot of family strife. It drives a lot of domestic violence issues. It drives a lot of other petty crime. It's not only here in Vermont, but it's spread throughout the country.
So we should probably have one of those prescription drug drives, I guess. I
fact,
heard something about that on Albany TV, I think a week ago, where they just basically had everyone bring in all their old unused drugs for a cold they had a year ago that, it's hard to get rid of the stuff.
It is very difficult.
They just got it away and got it out of harm's way.
In fact, there was just one done by the Bennington County Sheriff's Department here in the county at the end of September, and we're having conversations right now with the collaborative here in Manchester to replicate a drive like that. But it's not simple because you have to follow Drug Enforcement Administration rules, you have to have an inventory, you have to have someone that's willing to take them, dispose them, so you got to do a little bit of work. But one of the access points for people to get their hands on pharmaceutical drugs is through burglaries and thefts from houses of pharmaceutical drugs that are sitting in medicine cabinets. The other point is there are trafficking groups developing in the Northeast who are trafficking in large amounts of pharmaceutical drugs by diverting them from other locations and also diverting them internationally. The internet's a challenge because you can order these type of medications over the internet illegally and obtain them.
So, given all that, is there any trend or any major concern you have about crime right here in Manchester? Is there any particular, you've mentioned vandalism and a few other things. Is that basically the number one thing? I mean, in the police reports that we get, it seems like that's frequently that, or domestic assault type cases seem to be the two major things.
Right. I mean, I think there's, here in Manchester, Manchester is an example of what I talked about earlier in Vermont. There's a norm in this community that people have set, which is very healthy, that they expect to live in an environment that is safe and peaceful, and Manchester has been able to accomplish that, not just by hapstance. It takes a lot of work. And my read of this since being directly involved in the police departments since July and seeing the reports coming across my desk, it's exactly what you talked about. It's vandalism, it's domestic violence, it's disturbance amongst neighbors, and at the end of the day, the majority of that stuff is being driven by some type of substance abuse, either alcohol or some type of illegal or legal drug. And so those are the major issues that I think have to be addressed. And I think there is a very good network in the town that the police department can partner with to further reduce the results. The results of that is crime rates. And I think we have the ability, by focusing in on the base core of what's causing these issues to even drive our crime rate down further, which is already a very safe crime rate. Now, I will say to you that I don't have the number here in front of me, but that 2009 report that you talked about, Manchester's violent crime rate had dropped, I think it was 4.8%.
Right.
But with that said, the numbers are so small
Right.
that 4.8% is almost, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as being a very safe area.
Very
I
safe
mean,
area.
As someone who lived for a while in New York City, for
Right.
instance, I don't think this strikes me as being an.
But you know, we had a
unsafe place
rash
to
about,
be.
I would say
living in.
about 3 weeks ago. You know, we had a rash of rash of thefts from cars, from trailheads.
Yeah.
The Equinox Pond, Lye Brook. You know, we're talking internally now about doing a better job of trying to educate the public about it is a safe state. But that doesn't mean you leave your pocketbook
Right.
sitting inside a car while you run inside Price Chopper
Yep.
with the car unlocked.
Yeah.
Because you know, it is a safe place, but that doesn't mean you should not be taking precautions to be able to deal with that. And
Right.
you know, I'm hoping in the next couple months that we kick off a new website. We've secured a Twitter account.
Okay.
So we can tweet. All that stuff I'm a little uncertain
Yeah.
about, but I have found people inside the police department that understand that stuff
More net
better
savvy
than I.
you are.
And so we're looking at those kind of things to continue to educate the public about if we have a rash of car thefts. We just received a federal grant through Homeland Security for to place computers inside the cars. So literally an officer could be at the trailhead at Equinox Pond, taking a report from a citizen that their car had been broken into and their camera equipment was taken or other valuables were taken from the car, and the officer could sit in his car, hit the Twitter account, and tweet that information immediately so people would know, be aware we're having problems in these areas. And when you talk about the national crime rate going down, it's those small things that I think collectively across the country have made a difference in people taking precautions to prevent crime. And those are the kind of things that I think can really impact the crime rate in a given community.
Well, I recall going to one meeting your department held shortly after that break-in at the Max convenience store there, where a group of store merchants gathered, and
Right.
it sounded like there was an attempt to build some kind of a network of communicating
Right.
around about, you know, if there were counterfeit bills being circulated or if there was some suspicious characters in their store or something like that, to be on the lookout for something. It sounds like that's also part of that whole fabric of trying to kind of communicate.
Exactly.
And set up a Twitter account where they can tweet.
Exactly. Where merchants can hit our Twitter account and exactly. And you know, and again, one of the frustrating things for me is that I'm, you know, as I said earlier, I'm the interim chief on a part-time basis, and that stuff. You know, I look back on 3 months of where we are. I think we've made some progress on that, but I'd like to be going a little bit quicker. But we're going to get there. And you know, the staff inside the police department is absolutely very excited about the opportunity to do some of these technology things, because I have several young officers and young dispatchers there that understand this stuff better than I do, and they're pretty tech savvy, and so we're going to take advantage of that base of knowledge and grow the opportunities for us to better communicate with the community.
So it sounds like we'll be seeing the Manchester Police Department soon on Facebook or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that could
Why
be a
not?
possibility.
Right.
Absolutely. Many agencies are on Facebook. The first thing we're going to focus on, we just had one of our staff members attend a 3-day training on website building, and we're going to focus on enhancing our website, get our Twitter account up and running, so we can start tweeting. And I guess those are the terms you
Yeah,
use,
I
if
guess
I'm
it
not
is.
mistaken. And
Yeah.
we're gonna focus on that stuff right now. And as I said, we just secured a Homeland Security grant to put computers in the cars, and we're gonna try. That's all part also of a vision in the police department to be more visible in the community.
Now, the website you have right now, is that part of the town's website?
It is part of the town website.
Manchester.gov or whatever?
It is part of the town
Yeah,
website,
okay.
and you know, it's the town has a great website.
Yeah, it is.
I don't think the police department website is as good as the town's website, and we want to find a way to enhance that and provide better information to folks so they have a better idea about what's going on inside the police department and the kind of things that are non-law enforcement involved that we can give them information on. And we plan on using that to communicate with the community on a regular basis.
All right. Well, Chief, we're going to have to leave it at that, but thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for the opportunity, Andrew. I
telling us
appreciate it.
about all of this, and a real pleasure having you on the show.
All right, thank you.
And thank all of you for watching. This has been another edition of The Front Page. My name is Andrew McKeever, and we'll see you again next time, I hope. Have a good day.